This weekend, a new adaptation of The Running Man starring Glenn Powell from Edgar Wright drops in theaters. Well, as long as we're talking about The Running Man, why not talk about the original film starring this guy right here, Arnold Schwarzenegger? While I'm talking, be sure to join me down below in the comments section. Have you seen the 1987 Running Man? What did you think about it? Also, very importantly, have you read the book? Are you familiar with the source material? And in the case of this version of the movie, it's very different, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. With that in mind, you can listen to The Running Man for free if you sign up for a free trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. They do have The Running Man on there. I have not listened to it yet because I've been listening to something else that I've been prepping for, but I plan to listen to it, and I've already purchased it to start it very, very, very soon. But I love to read books with my ears, not my eyes. I have been an Audible monthly subscriber since August of 2015, so now over 10 years. I highly recommend them, and if you want to dive in deep into the world of Richard Bachman, Stephen King, you can do so at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. Get yourself a free audiobook as well as a free 30-day trial of Audible. Now, if you don't know the backstory on Richard Bachman, Stephen King wanted to start trying to kind of branch out and tell different types of stories and didn't want to just be locked in as the horror guy. So he came up with a pseudonym, Richard Bachman, and he wrote some of these sci-fi dystopian type stories and other things under a different name. And for a little while, he was actually able to get away with having the pseudonym, but eventually he was found out pretty quickly because, well, he's Stephen King, and Stephen King's kind of a big deal. But even when it came to making this original version of The Running Man, the people that originally had the rights were trying to figure out why kind of this no-name author was charging so much to license his books that weren't that successful. And then it broke that Richard Bachman was Stephen King, and they're immediately like, wait a minute, we got a Stephen King adaptation for only this amount of money. What a great deal. This is amazing. And thus, this movie came into existence. And let's get started talking about the good. And with this film, this is Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, his classic original run of movies. And it was like right before he went full-blown biggest movie star on the entire planet when you get to the level of Total Recall, Terminator 2, True Lies, where it was like this whole other level of scale, size, spectacle of just movie stardom. This was like on that initial rise where there was still just like this 80s charm to all of it. And this is deep into the 80s. It's one of these movies that is just so very 80s with almost every single thing about it. From the fact that during the game shows, there's like aerobics dancers and demonstrations and leotards, to the flavor of the hunters and them being, these bosses and everything with kind of the way that it worked out. The flavor of the game shows was the 80s flavor of game shows before we moved into the modern era of reality television with the host and the way that he talks and everything like that. And of course, you have classic Arnold Schwarzenegger with the one-liners and everything like that. It is just like such a true 80s product. And there's, if you grew up on those movies like I did, there's just something about them that is just so enjoyable in the distinctiveness. The 80s was a decade with a vibrantness or a flavor to it. Everything was big and bold, and thus you watch this movie and it's just like unashamedly goes for it. 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger sci-fi action fun. And in so many ways it was ahead of its time, like on so many different ways. Like the way that it predicted reality television, not just game shows, but kind of reality television on this whole other level, was very about 10 years ahead of its time. And even more so with kind of the extreme nature of where things are at, like with Mr. Beast and Beast Games and like the craziest some of this stuff. That kind of came after this movie came out. And this story was told, that flavor of the extreme nature of some of the stuff and fear factor and things like that all came later on, as opposed to just the game shows of the 80s themselves. But like it paved the way for the TV show American Gladiator, something that I grew up with, that had normal people battling these larger than life characters. It's a movie just filled with just fun over the top situations. The idea of the bosses, where each of the hunters is this like wild character with a gimmick and something about them, just makes for a lot of fun to be had with everything that kind of takes place in the boss fights and everything like that. But even on kind of a philosophical level, it's for a movie that is a lot of dumb fun. It's very silly. It's very goofy. It's also like philosophically much deeper than it's given credit for. And as 80s as it is superficially, it's very 21st century with what it's presenting on an ideological, philosophical level. There's a Christian philosopher named Francis Schaeffer who put out a book called How Should We Then Live? And the bulk of the book is following the primary philosophical thinking throughout Western civilization. What was the driving worldview of each era of Western civilization? And in the tail end of the book, it starts to dive into the modern era and what are we moving towards. And there's a whole chapter in the book called Manipulation and the New Elite. And it's about how, because of the trust we put in the media and the news, we've made ourselves very susceptible to propaganda and an authoritarian state. And he put this book out in 1976, 49 years ago, and he was just talking about all the ways that we can be manipulated by whoever has the microphone, whoever gets control of the TV screens. They control the narrative, and it kind of lists the ways that people do this, and it can lead us to something very dangerous. 5 years after Francis Schaeffer writes this philosophy book, Richard Bachman, Stephen King, tells a story that is all about that type of philosophy as this sci-fi thriller, dystopian thriller. And then 5 years after that, you get the movie out of it. And so it taps into actually some pretty deep, powerful stuff that have been explored since this movie came out many, many, many times. But at the time it came out, it's actually kind of ahead of the curve. So there's a lot of really cool things about this movie. All that said, there's a lot of things that aren't so great about this movie. Let's move on to the bad. And as I said, the movie was ahead of its time. It's Arnold in his prime. It's very cool source material. But in actuality, this is a mid-tier 80s Arnold movie. If you've got your Predator, your Terminator up here, and you've got stuff like The Raw Deal that's kind of just largely forgotten, that people don't really talk about The Raw Deal. And then you kind of have those ones in the middle that are cool, they're enjoyable, but they're not nearly Predator or Terminator. That's where this movie lands. As much as it has great ideas, the actual execution itself at times leaves room to be desired. Right off the bat, this is a movie that has a bizarre structure. And it has a very long and roundabout setup where Ben Richards is arrested twice in the first 25 minutes for the same crime. He escapes from prison and then he's arrested again. And so it's like this very roundabout way to get to the point in time where he's a convict being put on this show. And so it's like some of the stuff that I don't know if it went, how many rewrites or whatever happened, but like, it's just very odd and like, that was a really weird use of your time. That's a very indirect way to tell your story. And there's just a lot of things in it where the logic just doesn't fully add up, where the resistance base is in the middle of where the TV show is filmed, which just raises so many questions of like, you have this battlefield where they're chasing people around in this area, and in the middle of it is the resistance. Like, that doesn't feel like that makes any sense. Like, I don't understand how would that be there? and there's like these radar dishes that are at the prison, and like stuff like that, to where it felt like they're trying to tell a story that's this big about toppling the government. The system is out to get us. But then they could only make a movie that was like this big. It was right there in the middle. And because of that, it felt like some pieces don't actually fit together quite right. Even as you move into the finale of it, once again, we're telling this story that's huge. And there's this idea of the network controls the government and things like that, but you never feel like you get the full scale of this corruption and everything like that. So when you get to the end of it and the host of a TV show is defeated, that doesn't really feel like we're toppling the man. It plays it like we're toppling the man. Maybe that implication is in there a little bit, but it's never really as big as it feels like it should be. Because once again, we're telling a story that feels like it's this big, but it really wants to be this big. And then, like along those same lines, all of Arnold's dialogue it's like exclusively one-liners, his quips, but it's like they're all the B-sides. Like Sub-Zero, more like Total Zero. This is not like up there with the best lines. Like when there's not a bunch of people at conventions yelling at him to say that one. It's no get to the chopper. Like it's not on the same level. But it feels like every line is trying to be the next catchphrase, but never quite there. Some of that's the charm of the movie, is that it's all one-liners, but they're also just not as good as his classic one-liners. And the script was written by, was it Stephen D. D'Souza, who did Commando right before this? And you can kind of get that it's someone that's got a little bit of his tongue in his cheek, and you're combining like Stephen King really dark material with a screenplay and screenwriter and a leading man that are more like jokesters a little bit. Jokesters probably is stating a little bit wrong, but that tongue-in-the-cheek spin on it. And that's what this feels like. And is that the absolute best way to adapt what Stephen King was going for? I'd say something gets lost a little bit in there when you're trying to do that. But when you put it all together, like I think Running Man, like I said, it's a solid mid-tier 80s Arnold movie. There's a lot of really cool stuff in here, but it never really reaches the heights of a Predator or Terminator. It's nowhere close to being as good, as memorable, as well-rounded, as quotable as those films, despite being based off of Stephen King material that was quite a bit ahead of its time and theologically or philosophically very rich and deep material. Overall, it's a B on the entertainment scale, a 7.5 out of 10. And it's worth seeing, but this is not a must-watch Arnold Schwarzenegger or Stephen King adaptation. Tune in on my main channel where I'll be talking about the new movie today. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV.